I don't think that was quite as long as the one I made Joanne read last week, but the narrative lectionary does give us these big chunks of text, and I encourage you to read the in-between parts as well. This morning you heard both accounts when Abram heard the promise of God for his descendants to inherit the land, have more descendants than he could count, to be a blessing. In the first version, he leaves his home country and his father's house, everything he knows, to become a refugee of sorts, to travel to the land God will show him. He's told his name will be great. And of course, the way for your name to be great back in those days was to have many children and to watch them have many children too. But Abram and Sarai would love to have many children, even one child at this point, and they have none. So he goes, he packs up his wife and his camels and heads out. The promise is enough. He just goes. He doesn't question God. He goes. Abram has enough faith for all of us in that moment, at least. He'll have a few other moments where he seems to forget it. But here, I'm not sure why God gives him the promise twice, but I'd like to think it's because God knows us well enough to know we need encouraging, that we need reassurance, and maybe we sometimes need that gentle reminder. God's faithfulness needs no renewal, but human faithfulness to God needs constant renewal. We need to hear the promise again and again and then again. So this time, God directs Abram to look to the heavens to try to count the stars if he is able. The promise is given a tangible marker, a sign, something more than words. All he has to do is look to the heavens. That's such a comforting thing to me, that reminder that all I have to do is go outside and look to the stars, and I'll be reminded. I don't see as many stars living in the city as I do when I'm out in the woods or up at the cabin at the lake where my family has a cabin, but looking at the stars is one of my favorite things to do. And it can be a little terrifying to be reminded of the vastness of the universe and wondering what our place is in it. It's also comforting to me to know that in a universe this immense, God still cares for us. As the psalmist writes in Psalm 8, when I look at your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of us, of mortals that you care for us? Looking at the stars is a reminder of the promise God gave our ancestor Abram. And we are here, sitting here thousands of years after the promise. We are the proof of it. We are the descendants of Abram, as Allison talked about. We are numbered among the stars, the sign of God's promise being fulfilled. But we are also not the entire universe. We are just one piece of the promise. I don't know about you, but I believe somehow that if I had a clear sign about what God wanted us to do, then my faith would be stronger, right? That if we just had a clear sign, we'd have more courage to do what God is calling us to do. But the story of Abram reminds us that even when God does speak directly to us, even when God gives us clear direction and clear promise, we still need God's reminders. That is good news, of course, because having your name made great to be a blessing, ancestors more numerous than the stars, what's not to like? But the problem with stars is you can't see them during the day when the sun is shining and everything is happy. Barbara Brown Taylor said, during the day it is hard to remember that all the stars in the sky are out there all the time, even when I am too blinded by the sun to see them. Darkness is also a part of the promise. If you want to see the sign, it requires darkness. About 16 years ago, I had the privilege of visiting the Middle East, and I got to ride a camel to the top of Mount Sinai, or you can take a camel most of the way up at least. It was an experience that I hope I remember forever. Thick blackness all around, the sounds of camels and disembodied voices talking in the dark around me. My camel, who I named Lucy, had an Egyptian guide to guide us up the mountain, so all I had to do was look up at the heavens. The stars seemed so close and bright, I thought I could touch them if I just stretched out my hand. After a while, the trail becomes too steep and narrow for camels, so you hike up the rest of the way in the dark. And I figured out it's actually easier to walk in the dark without a flashlight. The flashlight did illuminate a particular patch of ground, but then it blinded me to everything beyond that small circle of light. It was easier to walk in the dark. Rose Cousins is one of my favorite musicians. She has a beautiful voice, is a powerful songwriter, and she has a song about darkness that includes this line: "To take a light into the dark is to know the light. To know the dark, go into the dark." It's such rare advice to hear someone sing that we need to go to the dark to know the dark, because we most often talk about a light shines in the darkness and the darkness cannot overcome it, right? I much prefer that image. Embracing the darkness is not something easily encouraged. I recognize also that light and dark can be troubling metaphors. In subtle ways, it plays out in our national wound of racism. When we value light and curse darkness, it informs the way we see each other and the beautiful shades of skin that are on our bodies. Also, my father was legally blind for most of my life, and visually, he understood darkness much differently than I ever will. It would be problematic to equate visual darkness of blindness to be a sign of being unaware or sinful. So we have to acknowledge the limits of these metaphors. But it is the image we've been given in the story of Abram. And for him, darkness is a part of the promise. To see the stars, he has to go into the dark. A few verses later in chapter 15, after what Victor read, we're told this: "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended on him. The Lord said to Abram, 'Know this for certain. Know that your offspring will be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and also will be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. And I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, and you shall be buried at a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation.' On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants I give this land.'" A deep and terrifying darkness descended on Abram. And I know some of you probably wish I had stopped reading when the lectionary did, when everything seemed easy and prosperity and good times were just down the road. But our promise is a complicated one. Abram, the man with a future as bright as the stars in the night sky, still descends into deep and terrifying darkness. And it is then that God spells out what will come. Human nature would tell God that that was a really bad way to share the news with Abram. The poor man had just descended into darkness. I suspect if I had been there in person with Abram, my tendency would have been to reassure him that things aren't as bad as they seem. "I know it seems dark now, Abram, but the sun will come out tomorrow." God instead tells him, "Know this for certain." God's not messing around with this news. Some of those stars in Abram's sky will know darkness too. His descendants will live in a foreign land as refugees, oppressed, as slaves. We are people who live in a world where bad things happen, where war and violence scatter people around the globe. We live in a world where disease cuts promises short. We cannot keep the darkness out. And that's when God speaks the promise in new ways. To take a light into the dark is to know the light, but to know the dark, go into the dark. And in the dark, God is speaking a word of promise to us, specific promise of how in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the adversity, in the middle of the oppression and slavery, in the middle of all of it, God is busy working to redeem the darkness in our lives. Dark is not a permanent location. I sat at the top of Mount Sinai in the dark morning hours once we'd all climbed up and gathered on the edge of the mountain. We talked. We sat in silence, we waited. And waiting in darkness is disorienting. We did not know what this mountaintop looked like. We didn't know how many other people were on the mountain with us. We knew others had been climbing in the night. We just didn't know how many. Waiting in the darkness is isolating. The stars were beautiful and I knew I wasn't alone, but I also didn't know just exactly who was there to help or where to go. The darkness didn't have pathway lights and well-marked exit signs to indicate a path to safety should something happen. But as we waited in the darkness, dawn slowly arrived, almost imperceptibly at first. And I started to realize that the darkness wasn't as thick as it had been a few minutes before. I noticed I could see more than had been visible a few moments before. I started processing all the visual clues around me that came into focus with the rising of the sun. I saw the path we had just climbed. I was reminded I was not alone, both in the faces of my friends, but by looking out and discovering there were literally thousands of people from all over the world perched there on God's holy mountain. I had never been alone in the darkness, no matter how alone it felt. We saw the sun rise, and as it did, the darkness moved on to another corner of the world. Darkness is not a permanent location. As far removed as we are from Abram's dark night of the promise, there are generations of people that are still to come even after us. It is now our turn to count the stars if we are able. What do we owe future generations so they will also be as numerous as the stars? What choices are we making today that will make their world and their lives better? There's an old proverb that states, "A society grows great when old people plant trees under whose shade they will never sit." A society grows great when old people plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. Our journey of faith calls us to live into that proverb. As we have been the beneficiaries of so much from those who came before us, so too we work to create blessing for those who come after. Our faith calls us to keep the air and water and earth clean and healthy. Our faith calls us to careful stewardship of the earth and her resources. Our faith demands we attend to our effect on our climate. Our faith calls us to invest in people and to make their lives better too. Today, you're invited into a conversation in Calvin Hall during coffee hour as the Faith in Action Committee is seeking input on where we should focus some of our financial and our volunteer support in 2023 with our Matthew 25 partners, and we hope you'll join that conversation. Counting the stars is an act of hope. There's a lot of despair around us, and people are rightly worried about the state of the world, the rise of authoritarian leaders, the danger to our planet, worries about our own health after 2.5 years of pandemic. As I mentioned recently, despair is a legitimate feeling to experience, but it's only a way station where we pause before we get back to the hope business. So here's some hope data to counteract the despair of our current news cycle. 200 years ago, average life expectancy was less than 30 in the world. Today it is 73. Back then, over 80% of the world lived in poverty. Now less than 10% does. Back then, only 10% of adults could read. Today, more than 85% can. We can thank the people who came before us working on those problems, and our faith is what calls us to continue to address them for the people still to come. How can we make the world even better? As people of faith, we are reminded the promise written in the stars is not one of prosperity or easy success, wealth, or fame. It is a promise that no matter how terrifying and disorienting the darkness could be, we're never alone in it. God speaks the promise in new and different ways in all moments and situations of our lives, even in the proverbial darkness. Abram doesn't know the ending of his story at the point we just heard and read. We have the benefit of hindsight to look back over the years to see how God had made that promise come true for him. In and through all, God is speaking to us through the darkness so that we can have hope that we will see the light, as did our descendants. Friends, let us live into that promise together.